Hello, I'm Jay Birschbach, and welcome to this WGTE Town Hall, Detecting Invasive Species in the Great Lakes. During this hour, we are discussing the potential of invasive species being introduced into the Great Lakes through bait shops and pond supply stores, and the research that is being conducted at the University of Toledo and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, to address this concern. We will also hear from members of the sport fishing community as well as regulatory agencies on the potential impact invasive species on the Great Lakes ecosystem. If you at home have any comments, questions, or if you want more information, you can contact them with the research team or contact the research team using the information on your screen. To get our conversation started, let's take a look at this clip.
So what we're doing is we're looking for invasive species that may be mixed in with the regular fish being sold for bait.
This is more of a market problem that was created by the market. And I look at this as the solution to it has to be a market-based solution.
One of the things we've been doing is trying to figure out the supply chain for the bait stores. Where are these bait stores getting their bait? We've mapped the bait stores and then the suppliers. And if there's a source that might be more prone to having invasive species in it, then that, may be something to look at.
Fishermen, they may travel a long way to fish, and they may just pick up bait in their local waterway. They don't think anything about it, that they're bringing it into a different watershed, and then they may release it. So that's what we're hoping that our project helps to educate the public about that. Also developing a voluntary certification program for bait shops that they can say that they're proud to be invasive free. So a lot of this is education and public awareness.
Starting our discussion, let's meet the UT scientists who have been conducting this project. On our first panel, we have Dr. Kevin Sykowski, Professor of Geography at the University of Toledo. We have Dr. Carol Stepien, Distinguished University Professor of Ecology at the University of Toledo and Research Division Leader at NOAA. We also have Dr. Andrew Solocha, Professor of Finance at the University of Toledo. And we have Nate Marshall, a PhD graduate student in the Department of Environmental Services at the University of Toledo. So first of all, welcome to the four of you. This is the panel, first of three. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, and our first question actually goes to Dr. Stepien, and this is a great way to lead off the program. What prompted this study?
Well, about 3 years ago, there was a call from the US EPA GLRI, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and I was trying to think of something new and cool with Kevin and Andrew about what to do. For 25 years, I've worked on adapting the latest genetic technology to help solve our invasive species problem. And originally I started with the zebra and quagga mussel invasions that came over from Europe, and we genetically tracked where they came from in Europe, how many invasions, how many species, and then when they moved out west via trailer boats, we tracked the pathways and where they came from. Actually, they came from Lake Ontario, and then got trailered out then to the bottom of Lake Mead, et cetera, and to California. So both species went out there. There was a great boater education program in the western US or the western Great Lakes, and that didn't work well in the eastern Great Lakes. Okay. So that's where they came from.
Okay.
So that's what we've been doing.
And what have you found from the DNA testing?
Well, here we're testing bait stores and pond stores as vectors for invasive species entering the Great Lakes. And so we sampled all through Lake Erie, the Wabash Rivers watershed, and also Lake St. Clair region. And so we went in with our students undercover, and they brought like a few dozen bait fish, and out in the parking lot, they anesthetized the fish, put them to sleep, okay, and they seined off the water, and we tested with environmental DNA testing. So we used the latest genetics. We used metagenomics and high throughput sequencing to identify which species and critters were there.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Our next question goes to Dr. Sykowski, and the question is, how is geographic mapping part of this study?
Well, as a geography professor, the field of geography has changed a lot in the last 30 years. Now we use geographic information systems to map things and look at why things are where they are. In this study, we had a survey. The students went to places where anglers were, people were fishing, marinas. They even went out on Lake Erie when it was frozen and had the anglers fill out the survey. And they're asking them, where do you fish, how often, what type of bait do you use, and what do you do with that bait when you're done with it. We mapped those things. We also did a map of the supply chain. And then we're hoping once we finish all the invasive species analysis to map that as well. Now, some of the things we found were that about a third of the anglers in Lake Erie use live fish bait to fish. And it turns out about half of them dump their live bait once they're done fishing. And I actually used to do that when I was fishing too. But I thought that was the right thing to do.
Sure.
But it turns out it's not. After meeting Carol and Andrea on this project, that you're not supposed to do that.
Okay.
Let's see. Some of the other things that we found. A lot of the anglers are usually 40 years old or older. They've been fishing for 20 years, so they have a lot of experience. And what was interesting, we asked them, have you seen invasive species in the lakes or in the rivers? And pretty much all of them have seen some invasive species. And most of that was round gobies, but there were a fair number of anglers that said they had seen Asian carp. They put that in their survey.
Wow.
So we're not sure what that means. It's the self-reporting, but it's something to look into further.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, thank you. Next question for Dr. Solocha, and the question for you is, what have you learned from studying the supply chain of live bait?
Well, it's a really interesting process because it is really a market problem. We have people that are demanding the bait. Those are people that go fishing. And then you have the people that are supplying the bait. And they supply the bait from several different areas, not just from the local community. And the problem that we have is the people that are buying the bait don't really know what kind of bait that they're buying. And then the people that are selling the bait really don't know what they're selling. So there has to be a lot of market information that is passed on to these people to try to explain to them. It's like Kevin dumping his bait after he was done. Mm-hmm. He did it not because he was doing it intentionally, but because he just didn't know what the right thing to do is. So part of this is an educational process to the consumer and also an educational process to the suppliers. So we have a supplier that is going to be talking on this panel, and he has a degree from BG in environmental sciences, so he actually knows what kinds of bait are in his supply. And when we tested his fish, we found out that they were clean. And that's because he was well educated, and the people that are coming to his shop are pretty well educated. We have to continue that process. Also, there is a notion about a voluntary certificate program to make sure that the supply is clean of any invasive species. Now, there is a similar program that everybody is familiar with when they go to buy an appliance. What they'll find out is that there's a little sticker on there that tells you how much electricity that you will use for a year. Well, that is a voluntary program. That is not mandatory. That is a way of educating the consumer about the products, because when you walk in, you don't know one washing machine from another washing machine. And the same thing is true with a fisher person, is that they walk into a bait shop, they don't know what they're buying. So a lot of this is really educating both the suppliers and the final demand, the fisher people.
Okay, very interesting. The financial side kind of on that one. Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Next question is for Nate Marshall, our fourth member of this panel, panel number 1 of 3. What results have you found from this study, Nate?
Yeah, so quickly I'll just say we were well aware of that non-native species can be in bait. So we wanted to sample bait shops in this area to determine how often that occurs and what non-native species appear in the bait. So over the past 2 years, we went to about 45 shops, and we went to them a couple different times and would buy about 2 dozen fish each time we would go out. And we would morphologically identify the fish. So what I mean is we would look at each individual fish of the 2 dozen fish we bought and identify what species that was. And then we would also take water samples from the tanks within the bait shops and save that for further genetic analysis. And the major takeaway from that portion of the study was that lots of these bait shops have non-target species present in their tanks. And what I mean by non-target species are species that they aren't advertising for sale and they're within their tank. Through our genetic analysis, we identified 69% of our samples had non-target species within the tank. So yeah, it's quite a high number. Wow. And these non-target species include a lot of invasives such as silver carp, round goby, alewife, rainbow smelt, and western mosquito fish.
Wow, so almost 70% is what you found had
a
stuff in there they didn't know they had in there.
Or they weren't claiming was in there.
Okay.
Sometimes this could be they're saying they're selling golden shiners, but actually they're selling emerald shiners. Okay. So that is a bait fish. But it's a problem if they don't even know what they're selling. They're calling it something different.
Okay. And to follow up too, what are the genetic techniques used?
Yeah, so for our genetic analysis, these bait shops will have hundreds to thousands of individuals in a tank. So it's not feasible to walk into a shop and identify all the fish that are in that tank, let alone doing it to all the shops in the region. So we use this tool where we would take a water sample and identify the environmental DNA in the tank. And what I mean by that is right now we're shedding skin cells. And in those skin cells there's DNA. So fish are doing the same thing when they're swimming around in these tanks. They're releasing cells into the water. So you can take that water, isolate the DNA or the genetic material in these cells, and then you can identify the species that are present in that tank from the DNA. So we did that with all our shops that we visited, and it was a very useful tool because when we bought 2 dozen fish, we never found a round goby or a silver carp. But with the DNA analysis, we did find a few shops that had those species, or at least had that DNA in their tank, which would mean probably that species was either in there or had been in there recently.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. For any of you, we have a couple more questions, so if you feel like going first, we can have a conversation between the 4 of you. But it's a general question, but how are the results of this study important for the folks watching at home tonight, for the ecology, the ecosystem, for nature, for the fish, for the health of Lake Erie? How are these results important to people?
Well, silver carp are particularly alarming because they are slated to be a really bad invader of the Great Lakes. And the shops are probably getting them from the Ohio River system or the Wabash, where they're pretty prevalent, locally, and then moving them up here from the supply chain, or some shops even buy their bait from Arkansas, where they're also really prevalent. So these fish are swimming up the Mississippi River at the threshold of the Great Lakes. They get huge. They get to be that big. They feed really low on the food chain. They eat all the food for the fish. And here we found it locally, just a few miles from the station, 2 years in a row in a local bait shop. Wow. And so they must be getting them from somewhere. Captain Paul, who was speaking later, thought they probably came in with golden shiners or so. And all these little minnows, look alike. So it's easy to make a mistake, but really bad for the Great Lakes if enough get released. Like, remember, the lionfish off of Florida went all through the Caribbean from aquaria releases.
One of the problems that we have is that the bait shops, the suppliers, get most of their bait from either inland ponds or they sign them from Lake Erie. Now, so when they get these boats and they catch all of these shiners, the problem is that they could do that all the way up until August, September, and October, and the reason they have to stop then is that the fry for the perch and the walleye are about the same size. So when they scoop them up, they can't differentiate between the two, and it's illegal to sell the fry for the perch and the walleye. So they have to go outside of the area. And one of the biggest suppliers in Ohio is from the Cincinnati region, which is right by the invasive species from the Ohio River.
We also found small walleye and yellow perch in the bait, actually physically found them too, being sold.
Wow.
So, you don't want to be selling them when we need them to grow up to eat.
Right.
That's right.
You don't want to be selling your important sport fish as bait.
Even though they are cannibalistic, they do eat each other.
The fish wouldn't mind.
No.
They don't know the difference, but we know the difference and the impact on the environment.
Right.
That's correct.
We don't want to encourage them to eat their own young.
Yeah. Probably a good policy. Another question, maybe you can answer, Dr. Psychowski. Are all invasive species, quote unquote, bad? And you can take that word
I'm
bad
not sure
as...
I can answer that question.
Okay, well, any of you?
Expert, but
Well, there's a definition of invasive species. They're invasive. The DNR and other organizations do this. In order to be able to be invasive, it's invasive because it pushes out the other species.
Okay.
So that's where the damage comes from, is they take over. So for instance, people take red sliders, turtles, and they dump them into the lakes, and they think that, when they buy them, they're this big, they're cute and all of that, but they get to be that big, and what they do is they dump them into the lakes. And the problem is that they're very aggressive species, and they could push out the painted turtles, which are native to the area, and deprive them of the food that they need.
So, and Carol, weren't you saying that walleye are invasive to other parts of the country?
Yeah, in fact, some of the footage for this was filmed in Seattle and in Lake Washington, right outside my office at NOAA PMEL. The walleye and yellow perch are invasive, and they're eating the baby salmon. So the fisheries out there asked me, please use your assays, your genetic tests, because we need to know where these things are and what they're doing. And they were intentionally introduced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service years ago, back in the 1800s. They brought boxcars from the Great Lakes and dumped them all over western reservoirs and lakes
Just
for fishing.
To stock them, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
and
well,
now
Pacific
they're
salmon in the Great Lakes. I mean, those were introduced. Right. So they're invasive. They're not native, and the question is, are they a problem? They were introduced because they wanted to reduce the population of alewives,
which were also invasive.
which were also
now
invasive.
it's an important fishery as well.
Yeah.
That's right.
So it's kind of qualitative, like what we value as humans.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
very
it's
funny.
really the impact on humans is what is going to classify it invasive, and then how invasive is it?
And the carp, the common carp, were introduced from Europe by the early settlers in this region. They brought them over for food, the disgusting giant carp we have in all of our marshes, etc. And so those are invasive too, but they were brought over intentionally for food.
Wow. It's funny, I know I do weather for my profession, and I go to students and talk about how the weather's all connected. Something happening right now in Japan will eventually impact our weather in whatever, a week or two, even today, with the different ups and downs. And it seems like that's the theme from the four of you, that one little thing, we brought the carp over 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and that has an impact on what was brought later, and then they brought a species, got here, and then they brought something else to take care of that species. We took fish out west.
Right.
Just seems like it's all connected. Is there a way to kind of combat this in the near future? What would be your short-term
One way,
advice?
we have to change our thinking. We have to think of in terms of systems. So we have to develop a systems thinking in terms of our leaders, our regulatory bodies, that they have to think in terms of a system. What I do does have an impact on you.
That's a good answer. And the goldfish that your child brings home from the fair or anything. We've all done this. It gets bigger and bigger, and after a while, they don't want to take care of it in the little aquarium. What do? You tend to release it, right? And then these things can grow to be 6 feet long, and they love it here. And we can't go fishing or seining or sampling in any of our rivers without finding a lot of goldfish. So that's pretty sobering.
So what should fishermen do with their live bait that they don't use?
Well, my understanding now is...
Yeah, you've done this, so we'll just we'll give you like a 5-year cutoff and you're fine, but go ahead.
But my understanding is they should dispose of it in the trash or something like that.
I think put it on ice and let it go to sleep is the most humane thing. As a scientist, I have to use a really expensive anesthetic, MS-222. It's probably better just to let them, they're cold-blooded, just let them go to sleep and, in the cold. And then get rid of them.
Just don't release them.
Don't release them.
Don't just dump that extra bait out because that's where the problem
Right,
seems
and
to
a
be.
lot of things travel with bait bucket transfers.
Okay.
There are other problems with ponds. People have these little ponds.
Sure.
So there's a pond right by our house, and what they've done is the Swan Creek comes through where it's really, really small. They've dammed it up, create their pond, and then it continues on. Well, the problem is that they put fish into those ponds, like grass carp, or they could put any kind of fish. And then in early spring, when it floods, those fish go right down into the Maumee River and then go into Lake Erie, which is a very convenient supply chain.
All right. Another question, is there any impact on the algal blooms from the invasive species issue? So that's been in the news lately for years with the toxic algae and the drinking water issues that we've had the past several years. Is there any relation between the invasive species and the algae that has been blooming?
Well, that's a good possibility. For example, we have 2 invasive drycenid mussels, the zebra and the quagga mussel. And the quagga mussel has been shown scientifically to process phosphorus differently, and it actually releases it. And phosphorus is a nutrient that fuels harmful algal blooms. So it's the primary limited nutrient that is in fertilizer that helps plants grow. And just like it helps our farm fields grow, it helps the harmful algal bloom to grow.
Okay.
And another thing is that silver carp have been shown scientifically that they don't care about microcystin toxin, the toxin in harmful algal blooms. They're immune to it. So I don't know if they developed that in China or what, but they just pass it through and they make it actually worse. So if and when they get into the Great Lakes, they're not going to help.
At all?
No.
Right.
You'd think if they're eating it, they would help and process it.
Yeah, it
but
just
no.
goes right through their bodies.
The zebra mussels also, it's my understanding, I'm not a scientist, but it's my understanding that the zebra mussels will eat the algae in the lake, and any of the toxic algae they just spit out. So what they're doing, they'll just release it right in. So what they're doing is they're taking out the competition for food.
Yeah, the good stuff.
And
They're
that,
taking out the competitors.
they're taking out the competitors, that's right.
Wow. Again, that just shows how it's all connected. And
That's right.
Yeah,
Everything
we have
is
so
connected.
many. We have 184 established invasive species in the Great Lakes.
And we have to really think about this seriously, because if you imagine Toledo and you take away Lake Erie, what do you have? You have a town of maybe 10,000 people. The amount of economic activity that results from Lake Erie is enormous. It is critical to this part of the country. So we have to take care of what we have.
all right. Well, thank you all so much, the 4 of you. Appreciate the information, the candor. Cantor. Anyway, but thank you all
Yeah,
very
thanks,
much for your
Jay.
evening. We
Thank you.
appreciate the information. So, such a wonderful discussion so far. And again, thank you for your hard work. Now we want to learn more about the implications of this work on the Great Lakes as a whole. To give us a starting point, let's watch this short clip.
Back just 10 years ago, what we would do was we would take DNA from every individual and have to run that separately. So now we can just put a genetic tag on the sample and we can get back all the DNA from all the organisms at the same time. You know, after the Human Genome Project, there's been a great revolution in genetic technology. And so here we can capture some of that innovation to help the environment, and in this case, detect invasive species.
When you look around at towns like Port Clinton, Sandusky, areas that are right on the lake, their business, the hotels, the restaurants, the bait shops, all of those kind of things are tuned in to the fact that people come to the lake to go fishing. Sport fishing in Ohio is a $2 billion a year industry. The big issue in us is the Asian carp. Lake Erie is an ideal place because of the nutrient levels that we have in the lake. The Asian carp are things that you can't catch by hook and line. They tear out the bottom end of the food chain, and that's the biggest issue. If they get into Lake Erie, it will just destroy our native fish, and that's our big issue.
We now have with us some experts on Great Lakes invasive species, and this is our second panel. First off, we have Dr. Rochelle Sturdivant, Program Manager of Galanzas, NOAA as well. We have Jay Hemdahl, General Curator at the Toledo Zoo. And then we have Tom Henry on the end here, an Environmental Energy Writer for the Toledo Blade. So welcome all of you. Thank you very much. Thanks. We appreciate you being here tonight. So panel two, we're going to start with Dr. Sturdivant. And I just said Galanzas and NOAA and all these acronyms. Can you first tell us what is the Galanzas program, what does it mean, and what does it do?
Sure. So Galanzas is a web-based system. It stands for the Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System. So it's an online database that will let anyone go in and find out information on any of the 187 established species in the Great Lakes, about 18 species that are moving around between the lakes. So a lot of those are native to Lake Ontario and invaded above the Niagara Falls after the Welland Canal was built around those falls. And then we have a watch list, which right now is about 67 species that scientists have identified as likely to invade the Great Lakes or at some risk of posing a problem should they get here. And we're constantly combing through and doing risk assessments on species and adding new information to the system. The heart of Galanzas is really about tracking the movement of those species that are here in the Great Lakes. So we have distribution maps. We're constantly getting data from our state DNRs, from field researchers, university-based researchers, and from the general public who find something and say, hey, what is this? And a report will get to us and we'll send someone out to check it out. And we'll put that information into the map. So you can go in and you can look for a species and you can see where it is. You can put in your watershed name and pull up a list of, hey, what's in my watershed? So it's a really good information resource, and that's really the core of it.
Okay. And a follow-up, how does NOAA study invasive species? And can you tell folks again what NOAA is?
Sure. So NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and Galanzas that I just discussed is a NOAA project to provide information. But it's not the only NOAA project on invasive species. We have researchers at the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab who are working on understanding what the next invaders are likely to be. They're doing the risk assessments. They're looking at, for things like Asian carp, if they get into the Great Lakes, what habitats are going to be suitable? What are their populations likely to do? We have researchers working on what are the impacts of zebra and quagga mussels on the Great Lakes? What are the impacts of bithotrephes? How is the food web adjusting to some of these species? What are some of these more distant impacts that they're having? And then we have an extension service through Sea Grant, and there's a Sea Grant program in each of the Great Lakes states. So there's one here in Ohio, and I'm affiliated with Michigan Sea Grant. And our Sea Grant extension programs are really all about taking that science and getting it into the hands of people who are dealing with these things in real life on the ground. So we're working with fishermen in terms of, what can you do differently washing your boats? there's Sea Grant folks who are working with the bait trades. There's a certification program called Aquatic Invasive Species HACCP, and HACCP was actually originally developed for the space program on how to make, you know, your rockets and your food for astronauts as safe as possible.
What was that again?
So it's called HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point.
Okay.
And it's a system for looking at an overall process in an industry and figuring out where things could go wrong, and then putting safeguards in place at those points. So we're applying that to bait fish in the Great Lakes and looking at, well, where in this whole supply chain could something go wrong and what controls can we put in place? And a lot of our bait harvesters that operate in this region and some of the retail chain are really, you know, they'll go out of their way and come to programs and learn how to do this kind of process and how to examine their own systems and figure out better ways to do things. So those are kind of some of the NOAA Sea Grant programs that are really getting down to the local communities and working with folks to try to shut things down, and everything down to local boat wash stations. So.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Sure.
That's very informative. Next question is for Jay Hemdahl. Nice name, by the way. Yes, from the zoo. And the question for you is, can you describe the Toledo Zoo's exhibit on invasive species?
Sure. Well, when our aquarium renovation was completed in 2015, one of the exhibits in the new aquarium was an exhibit of what we call living pollution, which are animals that are in an environment where they don't belong. Now, that's kind of a hard message to get across to some of the kids. And we want to make sure that we have some proper education occurring. And the concept is difficult to describe, and we certainly can't stand by the tank and try to explain it. So what we did was this. We put a toilet bowl in the tank. And that's visual pollution, right? Ceramic really doesn't hurt the animals. But what it gets them doing is the kids look at that, they laugh, and then they ask the parents, they say, why is that toilet bowl in there? And the parents have to look up and read the graphics, and now we've informed the parents, and then they can in turn tell their kids about it.
That's wonderful. The zoo is so good at that with the education that sometimes the kids don't even know that they're learning, right?
That's right.
It's fun learning for sure, and that's one of the exhibits that that shows that. Can you describe for folks at home aquariums, with their home aquariums, as that relates to a pathway for invasive species?
It's a potential pathway. I had home aquariums ever since I was a little kid. In fact, in thinking about this show, I recall when my father would take me to a bait store 50 years ago, and the store owner would hand me a net and let me fish through the minnows to look for the odd fish at the bottom, the little baby catfish or the sculpins, and I'd take them home for my aquarium.
Okay.
Those weren't invasive species, but they were definitely different. And the bait store owners got a kick out of it because I was so into the fish. But moving forward, I worked in pet stores, I worked in the wholesale pet trade, and now in public aquariums. And I realize that there's the potential for these animals that are being brought into the United States from all around the world and kept in people's homes. If they're not cared for properly and potentially released to the wild because they're unwanted, they could in turn become invasive species. Most aquarium fish are tropical, so we don't have to worry about that in Northwest Ohio as much. South Florida has dozens of invasive species throughout the waterways down there. The question is this: how far north would those fish still be a problem? We just don't know what the winter kill temperature is for a lot of these fish. Additionally, it may not be the fish themselves when they're released by a pet owner. What if they're carrying some disease that goes unseen that could potentially infect native populations?
So it's not just the fish, it's what they're bringing with them.
It could be.
Much like how I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, it could be. It's unseen. There are a few cases where some fish viruses have been transported with living fish from one point to another and then started up new diseases. And it just impacts the population, the native populations, in ways you wouldn't normally recognize.
All right, so just as people can transmit and carry diseases that aren't native to a country via plane or boat, much the same, that you can, it's not just the person or the fish there, it's the disease or the condition they're bringing with them. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. So be careful with your aquariums, right? All right, next question. Tom Henry from The Blade, thanks for being here tonight. Your question: how would you rank the invasive species problem and potential problems compared to other environmental problems in this area?
Definitely right up there. I'm trying to think back, 2002, 2003 in Cleveland, I was covering a Great Lakes conference, and the US EPA at that time had surprised some people because for years it was always assumed that chemical contamination was going to be the #1 issue in the Great Lakes region. And for the first time they said for their Great Lakes office there in Chicago that they saw invasive species surpassing chemical contamination as an issue. Now we've got climate change, we've got other issues too, but it's definitely a major issue, and I think a lot of it, getting back to some of the causes and reasons. I mean, there's we're in an era of global trade. It's hard to stop this, even going back to the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. I had scientists telling me afterwards, maybe just one of the benefits of that is that we'll have more protection at border control and try to stop some of these invasive species. We haven't seen a whole lot of that yet, but what it gets down to are the impacts. They disrupt the biology of these lakes, and it's very important. I've had scientist Bob Heath from Kent State made a good point one time. He said, at any given time, think about it. We're studying something, we find something, we write up a proposal as scientists, we get that funding for that, and then our research, we go out, spend time, collecting data, we get that peer reviewed. He said, this is such a moving target, the biology of the lake. He said, at any given time, we could be 4 to 5 years behind what's really happening out there. Anytime you affect the biology, you're going to affect the other fish species, and that affects the, humans, our economy, and why people come to this area to fish, the types of sport fish, and has a ripple effect on a lot of things.
All right, and how often would you say that you've written about this, or the Blade has done a story on the invasive species, no matter what it might be? I know we've done a lot of algae stories with our recent few years within the lake. What about invasive species? Have you done any kind of features, or have you gotten good feedback from the readers?
I always get good feedback on these stories, okay. and people have to realize there's a lot more going on than Asian carp, but zebra mussels and then quagga mussels after that were the big, and scientists a lot of times and lawyers, they want to have this treated as biological pollution, so they can use other tools. The lawyers can use other tools like the Clean Water Act to go after them. But I've, in many stories and columns and blogs I've done, I've referred to the Asian carp issue as a slow-moving biological train wreck. Something that we've seen for years moving up the Mississippi River, and at many points we were hoping there was going to be something done to stop, and now, it keeps encroaching and moving closer. But people are very interested in this issue. I had a former US EPA regional administrator say to me one time, he said, Tom, you can talk to people till you're blue in the face about zebra mussels. He said, but standing in a boat and having an 85-pound fish leap out of the water and hit you in the, let's say, below the belt, he said, that's what really wakes you up on the issue of invasive species.
You think?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's visual. We've seen that on the news, or if you've looked on the internet, that those fish just hopping like it's a parade or something, and it's it's a show of some kind. But to see that firsthand would
popping out like popcorn along the rivers.
Yeah, and they are heavy. They're big fish.
Yeah.
So it's a big issue. About 30 seconds left, Dr. Sturdivant. What do you see as the potential future of invasive species in the Great Lakes? About 30 seconds.
Well, I'd say we've made some good strides on the prevention end, particularly with the ballast water management. Hopefully we will keep those regulations in place and continue to make strides. I think we need to apply some of that same thinking to some of the other vectors, to bait, to organisms in trade, to aquariums, and start looking at where the control points for those are. And then I think we also have to get really serious about the spread between the lakes and spread from the Great Lakes inland and vice versa, or from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. You know, we've spent a lot of the last 20 years really focused on ballast water, and we've made some real progress there, but that's not the only story. So there's a lot of additional things we need to be working on. And hopefully we've learned from some of our successes with ballast water and are ready to move on some of these other issues.
All right. Well, thank you, the three of you. Very informative, eye-opening in some instances. So thank you for your time and your information. And we're going to move on now to panel 3. So thank you very much. We appreciate it. And now we want to connect this information to the local end users. Take a look at this clip.
Not only do you have to keep out invasives coming just swimming up the rivers, you may have to look at what's being sold in bait stores.
So I joined the University of Toledo for this specific lab with Dr. Carol Stepien, which does invasive species work and environmental genetics work. I've gone to some bait shops to buy some bait fish. So we would go to a bait shop, buy a dozen or 2 dozen bait. We'd filter out the fish and take the water sample and take that back to the lab.
And then that water that they come in should contain DNA from all the fish in that tank. The primary way that we get DNA out of these samples from pond, pet, and bait shops is we precipitate it, which means we spin it in a centrifuge really fast, and you can picture all the things in here that are heavier than water, or even about the same weight as water, are all gonna go to the very bottom of the tube as it spins around. And then once we've centrifuged them, we use ethanol in a pipette to just transfer the precipitate at the bottom that's there after we pour off the water. At the end, you get a small pellet in there. It probably contains some algae as well, but it also contains skin cells, DNA that's inside of cells like skin cells, and also DNA that's outside of cells.
And then we can dump out all the water, and we can take all that debris and take the DNA out of it. And then we can sequence that marker, and we know what sequences come back to what fish they were from.
What I'm hoping to do is implement some of these assays, both in the Great Lakes and across all of our oceans and islands, etc., on buoys and drones and any sort of platforms we have, to be able to detect what's living in our nation's fresh waters and marine waters. And so these are ways that we won't disturb systems, but we can know what's going on. So right now there's kind of a decoupling of the biological world from the physical and chemical oceanography. The work I've been doing, the research work, has been trying to bring that together. Science can tell us a lot of things that are important to us, like when we bring our kids to the lake shore or to the beach, what do we want them to see? What do we want the next generations to grow up with and appreciate? I think that we can use technology for good too, to coexist with the natural world.
Well, that works too.
And with us now, we have our third panel for this evening. First of all, we have Captain Dave Spangler. He's the Vice President of the Lake Erie Charter Boat Association. We have Captain Paul Pachowski, Lake Erie Charter Boat Captain of Lake of Erie Hopper Sport Fishing Charters. And we have Mario Campos. He's the owner and manager of Maumee Bait and Tackle. Thank you all for being here this evening. The third panel, our final panel for tonight. And you folks are the local end users, the local guys out in the water, out selling this stuff to the public and to fishermen, fisher persons. So first question, we're going to go with Mario here. Can you describe your business and its role in stopping introduction of invasive species into our lakes?
Right, I own a Maumee Bait and Tackle, which is a small fishing outfitters right on the Maumee River. So we deal with thousands and thousands of fishermen coming in to get bait every single day, whether it's worms, leeches, crawfish, and of course minnows. We have a big minnow tank that's full of that. One of the things that because like the last panel talked about, it's a very visual problem that we have. These giant carp flying through the air, smacking you, and you need a baseball bat and a hockey helmet to get through it. Nobody wants that, trust me. I look them in the eye, explain that. I have visual cards that I hang in different places in my shop, and I tell guys, hey, if you see this particularly looking weird type of minnow, maybe an Asian carp, throw it on ice, bring it in. We'll get it to the DNR guys, we'll get it to the right scientists to see if it's something. Because you have to inform the public. One of the things I do on my website is I take all this information that we've gathered today, break it down into layman's terms. Hey, we need to take a look at these things. We need to make sure that you're not dumping your bait buckets back in your neighbor's pond at night just to help him feed his bass that he has in there. It's little things like that that cause the problem. 9 out of 10 people understand that, and they appreciate it. One of the things we talked about a little bit ago here was the goby problem. It's a lot of fishermen now, if they catch a goby or they hook it, they'll throw it on shore or they'll toss them in the trash. They don't throw them back in the water. They don't gently put them to sleep, okay? That's not our business. So we're right there at the front line trying to educate the customer. And we keep an eye on our suppliers too. When I get thousands and thousands and thousands of gallons of minnows a year, I look through them. As I'm scooping them out, giving them to the customer, I'm eyeballing them. If something doesn't look right, I'll dump it in my bucket, check it out later. We change our water frequently. We don't want anything invasive coming in. We look for mussels, different kinds of larvae. I get, if they have growths on any of them, we check those out. And, we welcome different groups that want to come in and take a look at our tanks. And of course, the DNR and the wildlife, they like to inspect too. Hey, it doesn't bother me if we find something weird in there. We'll get it taken care of. That's the point.
All right. And your suppliers, can you mention where you get the bait fish from, and how do you know that it's a legitimate business that's giving you what they're saying they're giving you?
Sure. I try to get most of my bait from right here that is seen right up in Lake Erie, so they're coming right out of the lake. Sometimes we do find that they do pull them from out of state if it's getting towards the end of the year, early or late fall. So we ask for the certifications that they've been through the quarantine, to cross state lines, that the tanks have been inspected. There's also some local pond farmers that grow their own minnows that I get them from, and I have different ways that we check. We go through all their bait. I check it in their tanks, make sure that it's nothing invasive coming in.
Okay.
Yeah, so
it's very interesting. You got to think.
It has to fall on me and the guys that work for me.
Sure. Before it gets out.
Before it gets out to the customer.
Sure.
Right?
Okay. Thank you. Next question is for Captain Dave. Question for you: can you talk about the impact of the invasive species on the sport fishing industry right now?
At this point in time, we're sitting there primarily looking at the algae situation as number one, but in our background, actually, invasives and the Asian carp are really 1A, if you would. We are extremely concerned with that particular fish because of what it can do to the bottom part of our food chain and take out the fish that we're really trying to catch in the first place. So we know that Lake Erie is prime time. The Maumee and the Sandusky River are prime time areas for those two species. And if they do get in here, Lake Erie is going to be in extremely deep trouble. And our business will probably go away. There's really nothing we can do with an Asian carp. You can't even catch those by normal hook and line methods. So we are very concerned about that. We also are very encouraged by people talking about the GLRI. It was mentioned earlier, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. One of the things that we've really tracked a lot with the Coast Guard in the past 6 years is that when they come into Lake Erie with foreign freighters, they have been able to check every single ballast tank on every ship for the last 6 years. And that money comes from GLRI money. So every year we go to Washington and keep pushing and pushing because it kicks, a lot of times it gets zeroed out in a budget, and we need to have that back in for a lot of other reasons too, but that's one of them.
So if that funding stops, the checks on the ballast could also stop?
It could stop, yeah, it could stop, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because the Coast Guard has a program that they go through, and again, it's for the salties, the ones that come from overseas. Most of the bad actors we have in the lake now came from the Caspian Sea and Europe someplace. The goby is a good example. All of the mussel versions are coming from there. We have an awful lot of them that came through ballast water, and the more we can check that, the better it will be to stop something else out there. And then, of course, like I say, the Asian carp, that's a special case there.
All right. Captain Paul, same question, but looking to the future, I know you mentioned a little bit it could wipe out the business. Can you give me more specifics? Is it going to be a slow process? Do you see people, like, is it more of the fact that it might take out what's in the lake now as far as walleye and perch, or will people just not go fishing because they don't want to get hit by this 85-pound carp flying at them down the road?
The major worry about the Asian carp isn't so much about them flying out of the water. It's depleting the food source that the base of the food chain relies on, the zooplankton and the algae, the beneficial algae. So that is a major concern, that if there's nothing for the young of the year to thrive on, then you can actually drive down your population of sport fish. And our sport fishing industry is responsible for 11,000 jobs, yearly jobs. And that's a significant number. I mean, there's a lot of people that would like those 11,000 jobs. But there are things that, as fishermen, we can actually take a more proactive approach. I really liked what Mario said about what they do as a store, but we as fishermen, we could do things too. And a lot of our guys have switched to, when they get their minnows, they just dump them in a Ziploc bag with no water, make sure all the water's out, keep them on ice, they're good all day. If you prefer to keep your minnows alive, then at the end of the day, it's getting harder and harder to purchase emerald shiners, which is the preferred bait for perch. And when you do have them, or any minnows, with the availability or lack of availability, it's quite easy to just, at the end of the day, put them in between newspapers, dry them out. Once they're dried out, put them in a freezer bag, stick them in the freezer. Next time you go fishing, if you can't find any suitable bait, you will have at least something, or you could maybe buy less bait and use some of your frozen bait. So either way, those won't reproduce.
All right. And how do you go about making sure when you're purchasing bait, this is for either one of you, that you're buying legitimate, safe bait? Do you, I mean, like our first panel, you know, there's an idea that with the appliances, there's a yellow sticker. It's voluntary. It says it'll use about this much electricity. Okay. Is there any kind of sticker on a certain brand or anything that says this is certified to be what it is?
I have not seen one. During the spring, it isn't nearly the issue that it is in the fall. And because of what Paul was saying, where we lose the ability to get our emerald shiners. That's prime food for our perch fishing season, which goes in the fall. So now we'll start seeing something called the golden shiner, and they come from various places, even as far south, I guess, as Arkansas. And those are the ones that we really are concerned with. The shape and the look of one that's this size, if you really study it, you might notice that it's a little bit different from an Asian carp. But you really have to know what you're looking at to know that that is the wrong one. So that's where we really think that's going to be the biggest issue there. The part about taking your bait back and disposing of it someplace else, we, of course, all of us as captains, we control the bait. And when we come back in, I don't dump bait. We do what Paul's talking about. We actually, we'll actually salt it and freeze it, and we can reuse it. It's kind of a softer bait, but it will work. And I always talk to my clients and say, you know, if you come out and go perch fishing, don't dump it back in the lake. Especially if you have shiners, the real shiners, keep them. You might not have them for another week or two. So,
and we also buy from good bait shops that have a known reputation. These guys make it their business to do their best to maintain healthy tanks with the right bait. And you know, you put such a emphasis on what kind of bait you're getting. It's nothing for people to drive 30, 40 miles out of their way to get the better bait, the emerald shiners. That's the holy grail of perch fishing. Second choice would be golden shiners, and third down there is the Wisconsin mud minnow, and that's about the last choice for anybody. But versus having no bait, yeah, we'll use them.
All right, about 45 seconds, Mario. Final question. I know you've mentioned that it's very visual when you're looking at bait. How can the average person, they go to a bait shop, they buy some live bait, how can they help the issue? How can they determine what's good bait and what's not? Is there any way?
They can ask. Take the 5-10 seconds. Hey, we've heard about these Asian carp. We've heard about that they look a lot like a shad. And we have, and I left it over there at the chair, but we have pamphlets that actually show what one looks like compared to one of the invasive species. Take 30 seconds and the same thing. If they have a question, throw it in a Ziploc bag, dry it out, turn it in to your captain or to one of the local DNR guys, and they'll know what to do with it and where to forward it to.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate your time and the information from the local end users right here in Ohio and Lake Erie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, this has been such an informative and eye-opening discussion for sure. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this show. I want to thank all of our panel members, and the members of our live studio audience have been quiet this entire broadcast. And of course, thank you at home for watching this WGTE Town Hall Detecting Invasive Species in the Great Lakes.